Okay, so I'd like to just start with a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give and I will make the slides available somehow. I'll put them up on my Montclair website, or I'll send them to Gail or you. So I want to start with a quick tour of both student and the STEM teacher demographics in New Jersey. I'll talk about New Jersey specifically as a representative case of how things probably are in other states in the country in terms of recruitment, preparation, and retention. And then I'll talk very briefly about sort of this system of STEM teacher education. I think my session today, I'm going to focus specifically on university-based teacher preparation. My role is mostly in science teacher preparation, so I'll be the S in STEM, but I will talk about STEM in a larger scale as well. And then I think the reason I was asked to be here today was to represent some of the work that we're doing at Montclair State University that has caught some nationwide attention, particularly in terms of STEM. And again, I'm going to focus it on what I know about specifically in terms of secondary preparation. We also have some very innovative work going on in early childhood, in-service teacher and professional development. I'm going to focus specifically on secondary teacher preparation. And then I'm going to end with a little bit of pie in the sky, thinking outside the box a little bit, maybe questioning some of the assumptions that we have about how STEM teacher education ought to look in the U.S. in 2015 and what it might look like in the future. And I'd like to start with sort of a word about STEM. STEM is sexy, right? STEM, it gets money. It shakes the money tree. Social studies teachers wish they could put 2 more S's in there, right? And I'd like to just throw out at the beginning that STEM is sort of this word that takes on, it's a bit of a chameleon, that it takes on different meanings in different contexts. There is still a lingering afterglow of the scientists' contribution to the Allies' victory in World War II in terms of winning the war. And what followed in terms of an economic renaissance in the U.S. following the war, that again was largely based on the economic contributions of scientists, technology, engineers, mathematicians. And I think STEM, as we talk about today, still comes from there. But there is a larger sense, and it was in the title of this larger session about STEM for the workforce. And I'd just like to trouble that a little bit. And if you have time, if you're looking for some reading material on the ride home, I highly recommend this article, and you totally can't see the link at the bottom, but it's on VQR online. And if you just put Phillips and Sparta, Tennessee in there, there's a wonderful article about workers in the town of Sparta, Tennessee, who were able to increase the productivity of the Phillips light bulb factory there through a lot of STEM education, and they really did everything right. And at the end of the day, the factory was moved out from underneath them to China. And so we have this big story. I think I was probably the last generation that heard the story of do well in high school, get a good science degree, and then you'll get a good job. I was sort of the last, I'm 44, I was the last generation to kind of believe that. My students do not believe that. And I think as we talk in the larger sense about STEM education as an economic imperative and as an education priority for that, we're missing a larger picture of what STEM education can do and the role that teachers have in that. And I'd also kind of like to point out, sort of, if we look at places where STEM education has been really effective, this is Hong Kong, and you can't see it in the top there, but that's the actual skyline. Down below is the picture of the skyline on a clear day where tourists take their picture of the Hong Kong skyline, right? So we have this sort of the economic consequences of a highly technical, highly productivity environment. And we see environmental degradation not just overseas, we see it at home as well. And so I'd like to throw out the idea that STEM isn't just for educating a workforce. And in fact, I think we're going to gain a lot more traction. I'll talk about this in recruitment as well. We'll gain a lot more traction if we give people reasons for learning STEM other than that story which no one believes anymore, do well in school, get a STEM degree, and get a good job, because that's not a plausible story anymore. In many ways, we still need bridges to stand, right? We still need electricity, right? But I think the more persuasive argument is, let's have STEM education to learn to deal with climate change, to environmental degradation. What role does STEM education have in getting us out of this era of mass incarceration, right? What role does, I made a whole list here, right? I thought about this a lot. Universal health care, that's what, the president was probably here talking about to the hospitals. What role does STEM education have in that? Those are sort of the aspirational things we ought to be holding out to our students and to our prospective teachers. That's a reason to learn STEM, not the get a job scenario. Respectfully, I think that there's still plenty of reasons to learn STEM for that economic reason, but it's not the only one, and we can't let that be the loudest voice in the room, particularly for the future of our planet's sake. So I want to take a very brief sidebar here to look at just when we talk about the achievement gap, what are we actually talking about? Because again, it can sort of be this sliding signifier that means different things to different people. So I'm going to use some very tangible numbers from the 8th grade NAEP scores, National Assessment of Education Progress, sort of the gold standard assessment that's used across states in a non-high stakes way. And we can see very clearly that if we see here green and yellow as sort of what we want, the desired outcomes for our teaching, and this is in science, right? Okay, so if we look at the Asian and white student populations, we see that they've got 83% above basics. When we look at Hispanic, African American, we see much smaller, almost half, right? That's when it's disaggregated by race. When we look at it in terms of socioeconomic status, I put it in brackets because sometimes I have trouble keeping track. Not poor and poor. Just say it plainly, right? Not poor students, 80% above basic. Poor students, 44% above basic. That's the achievement gap. Gloria Ladson-Billings has helpfully reframed this as the education debt, right? A gap is something that occurs year to year in a budget. A debt is something that accrues over time. And so I think it's also helpful to point out this isn't just a year-to-year phenomenon. This is the outcomes of decades of segregated housing policy, inequitable school funding, and we can go back even further to Reconstruction and what happened in the U.S. following emancipation of slaves. All right. But I want to do something different here that I don't normally see done, and that's why I'm doing it here. So we can say, what would it look like if the achievement gap was not there? What would those graphs look like? Well, in a fair society, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status would not be predictors. They would have no correlation with academic outcome. And if we ask what that would look like, it would look like that, where the differences between any groups would just be statistical noise, right? When we talk about getting rid of the achievement gap, this is what we're aiming for. But I watched the news yesterday. Some people don't even want their kids swimming with other kids, right? So not everybody's going to be happy with this. So we have to recognize, too, that when we talk about erasing the achievement gap, it's not just this thing of filling in a hole, right? There's a power issue here. And we have to attend to that as we start talking about these state governmental things that influence teacher education. Okay, so in New Jersey, my home state, it's a lovely place to live there. I wouldn't want to visit, but I love it there. It's my home. We have it's about 9 million people. We have about 144,000 teachers. It's amazing how small these numbers actually are. We have about 7,400 science certified teachers, almost 11,000 math certified teachers. And I went and I pulled these numbers myself because I stopped trusting. People use statistics for different things. I got the spreadsheets of all the teachers. So all the numbers you're about to see, I kind of did it myself just so I could be sure that it was right. Teaching, at least in New Jersey and nationwide, is still very much a female-dominated profession. It's important to remember when we think about attacks on teachers and teacher education, there is still very much a gender component to that. It has a different flavor than what we heard about in India, but it's still very important. Particularly attacks on teachers' unions. We have to remember that in the United States, the rise of gender equality in the workplace went hand in hand with the rise of unions in the US. But we see that the science and math teaching force is slightly more male. When we look at it by race and ethnicity, the science teacher population is much more white than the population of New Jersey as a proportion. About a little under 60% of students are white, almost 90% of math and science teachers are white. Now, somebody might reasonably ask, well, this shouldn't matter, right? I agree with you, it shouldn't matter. But what we've seen in the research time and time again is that it does matter, particularly what we know about learning now, that if you're going to teach somebody something, you have to elicit their ideas. You have to know what their experiences are. You have to at least make space for those experiences because their ideas are the raw material for learning in your classroom. And if teachers are closed off to those possibilities, that's going to have an impact on their students' learning. So I would argue that, yes, this shouldn't have an effect, but it does. Okay, so now we're going to kind of start sliding with these statistics into the retention issue, and I'll kind of back end into recruitment from here. One of the things that we can see very clearly, this is for math teachers, and again, I compiled this just because I wanted to see the numbers for myself. I had heard that number that half of new teachers leave by the end of 5 years. When I looked at it for science and math, it's half leave by the end of 3 years. Okay, so our retention is horrendous. Richard Ingersoll out of the University of Penn in Pennsylvania has done some wonderful research on this. I highly recommend his work if you haven't seen it. But the most incredible thing there is you just look at that number of first-year teachers and you look at where it is at year 4. And I took this from the raw data in New Jersey. I think this bump here, I would probably call that the New York City bump, because those are teachers who have left New York City after having 5-6 years of experience and come to New Jersey. It's probably also a family bump, people who teach for a couple years, get tenure and take some time off and then come back. So I think we may regain some of those teachers we lose in the first 2 years, but I think most of them leave the profession. So the other piece that's really interesting here is more than a quarter of all teachers in New Jersey have less than 5 years experience. And the numbers for science are very similar. 25% of all science teachers have less than 5 years experience. Now, what's interesting is that the Race to the Top application for the state of New Jersey, which was a source of much comedy for us in the state as we watched that thing work its way through. But one of the good things about it is that it required some reporting of numbers we had not yet had access to. So this is we have now the first round of data. Teachers who are certified in between 2010 and 2012, in these new state data systems, states are required to keep track of how long teachers stay. So, let me go back here for a second, because I have these two columns. In the state of New Jersey, there's two main routes for getting teacher certification. They're increasingly inaccurately named, if I can paraphrase Douglas Adams there. We have the traditional route, which is university-based teacher education, and we have alternate route, and the main difference between them is student teaching, right? Both need content area degrees. Alternate route, you get the job first, and then you go back and you get the teacher content, the teacher preparation courses within a certain, there's a clock that starts on that. And I think it's within 2 or 3 years if you have some certifications. You have to finish your coursework. So what we see here is that the alternate route has a retention rate of about 43%. Traditional is about 2/3%. And again, these are just science teachers now, and this is just after about 3 years. So we can see that split of about half leave after 3 years. Well, it's a little bit worse for the alternate route than the traditional. If we included the year of student teaching for traditional, I imagine our numbers would look a little worse. Because they don't quite make it to graduation, people who self-select out of, or they get selected out, we've all known those people, to leave teacher education. And then we see the, this curve, when we look at it, again, the alternate route versus traditional, it's that same curve I showed you before. Once we get past that year 3, it's a little hard to see on here, but things do stay mostly static. We don't lose a whole lot in that year 4 to year 10. And I think it becomes harder to make any judgments after maybe between 10, 15 years because people go on and get principal certificates. Not everybody leaves education. So again, we see the same, and now in mathematics, the story is a little bit worse. It's about the same for traditional. About 2/3 are still teaching 3 years later. But the alternate route it's really mind-blowing. Only 38% of alternate route candidates are still in the classroom after 3 years. And again, we see the same pattern here that there's all that movement in the first couple years, and then for the next 10, it stays roughly the same. So a couple words about this retention issue. It may go without saying, but I'm going to pull on the, we have economists all throughout teacher education now, so I'm going to speak their language for a minute. The loss of so many STEM teachers represents a tremendous economic strain on schools. With turnover, it's an economic drain on the economy for people spend all this time getting certified, not to mention what actually happens in their classrooms. It is quite a tragedy. That said, most states put very little resources into induction support. And by induction, I mean specifically support during those first 3 crucial years of teaching. And I'm going to cap it at 3. We could, have a lot more support than that. Ingersoll and his colleague May have talked about if we could just retain the teachers that we lose, we wouldn't even have this teacher shortage, which we still do have in mathematics, particularly mathematics, chemistry, physics, and special education. And I'll talk more about special education in a moment. And I would actually say the high number of alternate route certifications, the fact we have so many, that bar is much higher. That's representative of our shortage, of those people who are, they're ready to switch jobs or they're ready to do something different. They say, hey, I have an engineering degree. Why don't I just go teach? That's the problem we tried to get rid of with the Holmes Commission in '86, right? Another thing I want to say about recruitment on the other end is that question of, well, who is it that's coming into teaching? And I think in the alternate route, it's sort of you have a couple different groups. You have the folks who want to start a second career, but don't want to spend a lot of time going back to school. If somebody wanted to be a doctor that way, I'd probably say, please not my doctor. But then we think about, well, how do people find out about teaching? We had to buy a new washing machine the other day, so I was Googling washers and I was on Lowe's. And for about the next 2 weeks afterwards, I started getting all these keywords. Google search pops up. How about this washer? And I was flying to Denver. Have washers in Denver? It's like, so there's all these keywords. I Google science teacher stuff all the time. Nothing has ever popped up that says, hey, would you like to be a science teacher? Nothing, right? And And I'm going to kind of give away a little secret, a Montclair secret, but I'm not much for keeping those kinds of secrets, so I'm going to give it away. Our #1 recruiting tool at Montclair State University, with a national reputation, historic teacher education college, our #1 recruiting tool? Craigslist. I'm not kidding. Craigslist, right? Most of our, and that's for our master's programs. They find out. So they find out about teacher ed because they're looking for stuff. And where do you look for stuff? On Craigslist. Amazing. The other thing I want to mention is, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I used to get up really early in the morning, go watch TV before my parents got up. Now, my son does that with Netflix now. He sneaks an iPad into his room and watches Netflix before we get up. But I remember seeing an ad when I was in like 5 or 6 years old for the Peace Corps. And it was a 15-second ad. I've gone back and I found that ad. I found that ad for the Peace Corps. I actually joined Peace Corps, 30 years later after I saw that ad. It stuck in my mind. But how are we going around saying, hey, would you ever consider being a science teacher? When are we doing that? I think we need to do more of that. I'm not saying we all have to become Don Draper in Mad Men and come up with a great ad campaign for science teaching, but it wouldn't hurt, right? I want to see ads for science teachers on the sides of buses. And you know who's figured this out? Teach for America. Okay? So let me switch into talking about the system of STEM teacher education and how we do it. Back in the 80s, a part of the debate about teacher education was, well, what's the best structure? And you look at research like the Teacher Education and Learning to Teach study that ran out of Michigan State. And one of the questions that they investigated was, what's the actual timeline? Are 4-year programs better than 5-year programs? Do we do a 4+1? Do you have, and over time, I think these researchers figured out that's the wrong question because teacher education is much more complicated than that. And Ken Zeichner has helpfully shown us how complicated it is by saying, here are all these different things. If you're going to study teacher education, you have to account for all of these. it's not just a test and control that we would do in a science class, right? You can't just have, one person go to a 4-year institution, another one go to a 5-year program, and let's see which sock is whitest at the end. It's not like that. It's very complex. But the piece that I think we've figured out, the piece that we've got a handle on as a field, is what happens in the teacher education programs itself, particularly in terms of STEM. And I think, I go to NARST every year, which is the National Association of Research and Science Teaching. I would say as a field, we are converging on this vision of what ought to be in a science teacher education program. And again, I'm just talking about the S in STEM. I'm sorry, but I would be talking out of my element if I were going beyond that. But I want to talk about these puzzle pieces here. What ought to be part of that? And I kind of came up with my list. We definitely need an opportunity to reinforce subject matter competence. We need rich clinical experiences, and with a nod to Deborah Ball, opportunities to rehearse high-leverage disciplinary practices. If somebody is going to teach science, they themselves need experience with scientific inquiry and knowledge production. Mark Winchell's work has been very clear on this out of the University of Washington. They need to know knowledge about students, schools, and society, and everything surrounding diversity and education and equity goes into that puzzle piece there. They need general pedagogical skills. They need to know about technology. I want Hall to come to Montclair and talk to all of our candidates about technology use. They need to know how to plan curriculum and assessment. Assessment is, it's one word there, but it's such a huge part of what we do as science teachers. They need knowledge of subject-specific pedagogy. Okay, if you're going to teach physics, like in India, and I was a teacher in Kenya, right? And our school, we were both colonial subjects of the British. If you trace the line back far enough, even us here, the schools looked very much the same, and there was an exam at the end. But if you're going to teach physics, you have to know what are the problems that students are going to have with Newton's first law. Are they going to? What are the issues that are going to come up? What are 6 different ways to teach that? New teachers absolutely need access to high-quality mentoring and feedback, and they need to engage with professional communities. Again, like we've heard in all of our presentations this morning. Most important for me is we need time. I think we're trying to do a lot of this teacher education work on the cheap. I'm going to make a pitch for you right now that STEM teacher education takes 5 years. I don't think we can do it shorter than that. We can have them teaching in schools before the end of 5 years. But really, STEM teacher education, and I'm going to get in trouble with my physical education colleagues who don't like me to say the word gym class, right? We have to say PE class. But I don't know that takes 5 years, but I'm sure that physics education takes 5 years. Again, I don't know. Maybe it does. Maybe it does. But they need time for opportunity for critical reflection on their practices, their beliefs, their goals, on what they're even doing. And then surrounding all of this, we're starting to get a sense of what this ought to look like too. I want to back up just a moment. So on either side of this, so we have a rigorous admission process, right? I think as a field, we've also recognized not everybody can be a science teacher. You do need some content knowledge before you go into it. We also need appropriate assessments of readiness to teach. Okay, I come here not to praise or bury EdTPA, but something in there, right? We need to be able to tell that people are ready to go out to teach. But there's other puzzle pieces we can plug in here, right? So some programs may specifically focus on urban teaching in district-specific contexts. The urban teacher residency programs that I'm going to talk about that I work with are in that vein. We also have discipline specializations, right? So at Montclair, we have biology, chemistry, physics, earth science, all in the same methods class. But if you go down Route 1 to Rutgers, they have a biology-specific, biology methods, and they have a physics methods, and they're 2 separate courses. So you can kind of do it different ways. And this puzzle piece, which, again, I would make an argument this needs to be a part of that 5 years, is the focus on special needs population, whether it's students with special education designations or English language learners. And at Montclair, that's the direction we're moving. That piece will be a part of that puzzle at the end of our configuration. Reconfiguration of our secondary teacher education program. Pretty soon at Montclair, we're not going to let people graduate unless they can work with special needs populations. Because we don't want to set up an elite structure in the schools where some people can do it and some people can't, and who gets those teachers? This is an image off the cover of Stephen Jay Gould's Wonderful Life, and it's the Cambrian explosion, right? So the biology folks is when, there's a tremendous diversity of life in the oceans, and I think we have right now, at this moment in 2015, a tremendous diversity in how science teachers are being prepared. So we have alternate route programs, we have traditional programs, and again, it's sometimes hard to tell one from the other, but supervised student teaching, I think, is the key there. We have residency programs, we have cohort programs, site-based courses, curriculum-based certification. That one's kind of interesting, where we have a program in New Jersey where people get certified in just, history teachers, or social studies, PE teachers, biology teachers get certified in physics, and they get the courses at the same time. My verdict's still out on that one. We have fast-track preparation, and we have these experiments in recruitment, selection, induction, and retention. And so this is a really interesting time, and I think what we need to do is, we're looking at what works, but we have to be just as creative in how we figure out what works. And so, shameless plug moment. So I looked at some of these in my book, Deep Knowledge. Okay, enough of that. When we talk about what kind of STEM teachers we're preparing at Montclair, we have a whole big long list, and it looks like the NCATE list that I'm sure many of you have at your institutions. But particularly in the STEM programs, we want our students to be experts in their subject matter who know how to teach that subject matter to their students. Okay, it's not just enough to have that degree, and we all know that, but it's really important to us. We also want them to model the informed active citizenship and critical thinking skills that we expect their students to demonstrate, and that includes this question of what does it mean to educate students in a democracy, right? How do we have democratic classrooms? Democracy is really key in science education, particularly when we talk about things like peer review, right? We also are very conscious of creating teachers who are knowledgeable professionals who are decision makers themselves. They're not following dictates from afar because their contexts are also different. They need to be able to make decisions in their own contexts. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 particular programs, and I need to say up front, I had nothing to do with the creation of, well, okay, one of them I did, but these programs are the result of a work of a lot of people, and I'll try to just mention them as we go because I think their work does need to be highlighted. And they're in 3 different areas. We have undergraduate preparation, which is what many people are familiar with, where people graduate with a degree in biology and a certification to teach biology, or a degree in physics and they can teach physics, right? Then we have our MAT program, our master's program. We also have a post-baccalaureate, but that one I think is shriveling on the vine. There's not much call for people who just want the certification and not the master's anymore. And the timeline is roughly the same, so why not get the master's? These folks in these programs have to already have a degree in their field, so you already need a degree in physics or chemistry or biology or earth science, and then we build on the subject area certification on top of that. And then we have this dual certification program in the subject area, and they also get the Teacher of Students with Disabilities certificate. So they graduate, and this is a master's program. All of these have analogs in the other subject areas. So I'm just going to talk about what we do in terms of STEM, and I'm going to use 3 programs. The first one is the one that I am involved with. It's the Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program. I'm in the College of Education and Human Services. My counterpart, Dr. Sandra Adams, is in the College of Science and Mathematics. Together we wrote this Noyce grant from the NSF, and we can fund 30 science teachers for 2 years. That's the length of time it takes to go through the teacher education program. It's a 2-year certification program for chem, physics, earth science, biology, and they do everything that the teachers in the other program do, except we kind of add things on. We do some things in the summer, we take them out to jobs, we want them to know what careers are available for their students, what's happening in biotechnology, what's happening in nanotechnology, what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry. So we add things up, and it's a cohort program in that we kind of closely monitor them. We meet with them monthly, and we don't let them sort of lose track of us. So they get a BS in their degree, and they get certification. They get their tuition plus a $3,000 stipend for 2 years. This comes with a commitment to teach for 4 years in one of New Jersey's over 1,200 high-need schools. And it's about a third of the schools in New Jersey are on this list. We've also partnered with community colleges for recruitment. I can't report a lot of success on that front yet because we don't expect to see a yield on that for another year or so in terms of applications. But we have been working in terms of trying to go into science STEM classes at the community college level at 3 different community colleges and ask that question that I said we ought to be doing on the sides of buses, right? Have you ever considered being a science teacher? So the next program is one, it's actually 3 programs. So we had an urban teacher residency program funded by the TQP grants at the US DOE. We had one of the round 1 ones about 6-7 years ago, and that ran for 5 years. Right now we have the Woodrow Wilson Teaching Fellowship Program, which is just focused on science and math teachers. The residency program also had an elementary special ed component. And then we just got the round 2 TQP grant, so we'll be running another set of cohorts in the residency programs. This one's a little different. It's a 1-year program, actually about 13 months, runs June to June. 34 credits, they get a Master's of Arts in Teaching. Strong recruiting and admissions component. The admissions gauntlet for this is pretty impressive. There's an application process, and there's also 2 days of structured interviews. The residents do receive a $30,000 stipend. In different versions of this grant, at one point we had Newark, so Montclair is very close to Newark, New Jersey. We had Newark Public Schools kicking in about $15,000 a resident per year. It's a great model as long as it's politically feasible because they're making an investment in teachers who they will hire into their district. When we switched over to Woodrow Wilson, that piece didn't follow, but it may come back in the next UTR round 2. And again, this also comes with a commitment to teach in a high-needs school, particularly in our partner districts. So we partner with, in the Woodrow Wilson program, we partner with both Orange and Newark, New Jersey, with the NMUTR that was just Newark, and they make a very strong commitment to hiring our graduates. And it's an amazing thing to say to somebody in a teacher education program, we're going to guarantee you a job when you're done with this. I can guarantee you the social studies teacher educators are not saying that to their folks. Okay. So just one other word about this. So there are a number of people involved in this. We have Sue Taylor, Monica Taylor, Emily Klein, Jennifer Robinson has been in all these, and I know she's a presence here often at AACTE. I'm Susan Ray, I'm Tanya Maloney. We've got a lot of people involved. So there's a lot of faculty and staff involved in these programs. There's a heavily, the university is invested in this program, frankly because we see it as part of that future of what our teacher ed programs might look like. The last piece was a program, and the faculty who run this dual certification program, Dr. Jen Goki and Dr. Vince Walensik. It's the dual certification program, and it's called Inclusive iSTEM. It's a DOE grant, again, to prepare science and math teachers specifically to teach students with special needs. I can say without a doubt that this program has just been amazing. And I think this is the direction that our larger teacher ed programs across all the subject areas are going to go. It's a 2.5-year program. Okay, the length of time is, it's quite a commitment. But they get their initial teaching certification in math or science, and they get that New Jersey Teacher of Students with Disabilities endorsement. There's some additional field work that goes along with that, and part of what happens in there is there's summer courses involved in this, and they're really, I think of them as more methods courses, but they're methods courses that are science focused and inclusion education focused, and they use this term content driven design challenges rather than problem based learning, and all of this is located again in a single partner district. And I think that the question now is how do we scale something like this up? And I think that those discussions are happening now. How do we scale this to new partner districts? Okay. Just a couple other things about this program, which are kind of unique. They get 2 observations during their fieldwork of these response to intervention, RTI-based small group instruction. So it's almost like during their initial fieldwork, they're already being observed in how they interact with small groups. In the collaborative observations, they have 6 of these, And the collaborative observations, I mean, talk about getting cats in a basket. They get their mentor teachers, the university supervisor, a content supervisor, that means somebody from the mathematics or biology department, and the candidate, and they have a structured debrief and a structured reflection after this. And then they have weekly facilitated co-planning. You see why we're partnered with a school district, because this would be impossible to manage across multiple districts. We have a very strong buy-in from Bloomfield, New Jersey. And the candidate is leading these co-planning meetings by the end. Okay, so just some things to compare programs. As we're talking about programs, some points of comparison. We have science methods courses, the field experiences, and the access to mentoring and feedback. And so we can talk about the number of methods courses as an indicator of what's actually happening in those programs. In our larger teacher ed program, we just have one methods course for most of our subject areas. In science, it's one. For math, I think they have a two, but I'm going to talk about just science. For our noise program, we have actually added a second methods course. So we've turned their student teaching seminar into a second methods course. And we could only do that with a course buyout. In the integrated iSTEM program, they have the methods plus 2 summer courses, plus all of these content-specific challenges throughout the year. Adds up to a little bit more than that in terms of methods instruction. With the 2 residency programs, the methods instruction is integrated. These are co-taught courses. So for example, I've taught in both of these, and I have to co-plan, what methods piece am I going to cover today? What curriculum design piece are you going to cover today? In the alternate route program, there are 0 methods courses. It's just a general pedagogy course where they sit in a room with again, I'm not picking on the PE teachers, but they sit in the room with people who have very different concerns than they do. And so it's really go get your own methods is what it is. And what should happen in a science teaching methods class? I think this is one of those areas of convergence, right? So we talk about next-gen science standards and the implications for teaching and assessment and everything else that goes with that. Curriculum and planning. Grant Wiggins passed away this last month, and he's been, his work has just been phenomenal in terms of all across Montclair in terms of the understanding by design framework. I want to give a shout out again to the University of Washington Seattle research team, who's been doing just some amazing lifting in terms of science teacher education. Mark Winchittle, Jessica Thompson, Melissa Broughton, who's now at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Hosun Kang, who's at University of California, Santa Barbara, and David Stroop at Michigan State. They've really put together a wonderful package of what ought to happen in science methods courses. And you can go to ambitiousscienceteaching.org to see that. Okay. In field experiences, again, in our larger teacher ed program, they have 30 hours in the field before they come into teacher education. And they have a practicum and a site-based seminar. And we work in this, thank you, we work within the MSU NER network. So we have a network of schools in which we do this work. In the noise program, we do that, but again, I mentioned before, we added the summer. In the iSTEM program, they have 120 hours of field work. Again, this is all before student teaching. In the Woodrow Wilson, we've started summer programs in Orange. We've been working with the Newark Museum and with some other youth organizations to make sure they have a summer experience. And they're in a full immersion in the class from September to June. Same with the NMUTR. Again, the alternate route, they're required to have 4 hours of observation. I think that might double under the new regulations, I'm not sure. But then they're hired as the teacher of record. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention is access to mentoring and feedback. So the cooperating teachers and university supervisors give feedback. And I'm just going to put this all up here. And the thing I want to point out is that they get a lot of feedback across all our programs. And we have to pay for that, right? That's not cheap. For the alternate route, if we're talking about why they're not retained, the only people they're getting feedback from are the school administrators and the peer mentors. And occasionally, maybe somebody from their teacher certification comes in and gives them one observation if they're feeling charitable. Okay, I'm going to skip this part here just because I'm almost out of time. So I want to ask, what's this future of STEM teacher education? First of all, that we need to think of STEM teacher education as taking 3 to 5 years, even once they have their bachelor's. And that includes the mentoring, right? The mentoring during the first years is just as important as pre-service. We haven't figured this out yet. We've written it into all our grants, right? So we have some mentoring support. We've hired retired principals and other teachers, science teachers, to give feedback to our candidates. But there's a lot of work to be done there. I think it's going to involve more use of the high leverage practices. So just giving the teachers iPads, and I think you talked about this a little bit, it's not enough, right? We need to be able to let them practice how to use these things in the classroom. And we do need more robust and valid assessments of teacher quality. And I'm going to say that not the high stakes kind. We need the kind that lead to a better teaching. So my vision of what it's actually going to look like, I've taken 2 kids through karate now. This is my daughter when she was getting a green belt a long time ago. But I think science teacher preparation ought to look a lot like karate, right? So what does a yellow belt science teacher know that's different from what a black belt science teacher knows? In order to move up a belt level, you have to demonstrate proficiency in a particular set of skills, right? And it's almost like a video game if you think about it. Like, it gets progressively harder as you go, and you have to spend more time at each level, and the thing you have to do at the end is a lot harder each time. And so I'm wondering, what is science teacher education, or STEM teacher education, what would that look like? Okay, so what might a black belt science teacher know and be able to do? If we think about STEM as a 5-year enterprise, what are the consequences for universities? Because they're only paying us tuition while they're here, student teaching with us, right? We need to get them mentored, but somebody's got to pay for that. And it might go without saying, but I'm going to say it, the achievement gap is situated in massive inequity. We can predict somebody's SAT score from their income to within a standard deviation. Our effect size is 16%. We're going to work on that. We're going to do our best we can, but the rest needs attention too. And I think, okay, I talked about that one. I want to just mention this deregulation of teacher education, the ABCTE. I'm talking to you, where you can take an online test and be in the classroom in a couple weeks, works against everything that we're trying to do in high quality teacher preparation. I'm going to just say, since I'm in DC, the state or federal government could just pay STEM teachers directly, right? There's nothing that stopping them from creating a STEM teacher corps, right? And figuring out how to do that. The state of New Jersey could pay every new teacher to have high quality mentoring throughout the year. We did a back of the envelope calculation one day, and that would be $100 million, right? And that's exactly how much money Mark Zuckerberg donated to Newark Public Schools. So we started calling that unit of currency one Zuckerberg. It would cost one Zuckerberg to provide high-quality mentoring to all new science teachers in the state of New Jersey for a year. I wanted to just throw out the question of incentives. We talk about, again, the economists have done things to our field that I'm not super happy with, but this word incentivizing, how do we incentivize teachers? They talk about paying teachers more, but really figuring out merit is such a hard thing to do. Maybe we should just say, science teachers have to teach 4 courses instead of 5. Right? Maybe there's a different way I think if you incentivize people with time rather than with money, you're going to get better results. Nobody's doing that. I'm also going to call into question this idea of incentivizing STEM teachers for high-need schools. I don't know that it works. I don't think we have data on that. We do it a lot. It's written into those grants that we've written. But I'm not sure about that. I'm going to leave that sort of I'm going to be humble around that question. I'll keep doing it, right, if we get us teachers for high-need schools, but I see a lot of them leave after their commitments are done. And I'm going to go ahead and say it, 10K and 10 is an anemic solution to the problem of recruitment. 10K and 10 is a good idea. It's kind of following this idea, hey, let's have a public-private partnership, let's get people involved. From what I've seen right now, it's just logos on a website. I'm not really seeing any impact from 10K and 10. I'm sorry if you're involved in that, but that's how I see it from my perspective. I do think that we need some kind of moonshot. Arne Duncan talked about, high-quality teaching is our moonshot. He said that at the very beginning of his tenure as Secretary of Education. But I feel like we've got this piece down in terms of teacher preparation. The moonshot we need is around recruitment and retention, and we're going to need resources to do that. It's not something that we can leave to individual colleges and universities. We'll experiment. We'll do all kinds of experiment. If you give us 5-year piles of money, we'll do all kinds of experiments. But this is something that needs a larger scale structure. And I'm kind of one of those people who believes in the public good and this idea that governments exist to do things collectively that we can't do individually. I think this is one of those things. And while we're spending money that we don't have, I think we do need to start with free college, right? Quality STEM teacher preparation is possible. It needs funding. We're losing people. Our STEM pipeline is leaking all over the place because of tuition costs. So I don't know how many Zuckerbergs that would cost, but Sarah Goldrick-Robb has done some outstanding work. She's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I highly recommend looking at her work around the current cost of college education. Tuition's about 40% of college costs now. And it's even stunning to me. I think I know this stuff because I'm in college campuses all the time, but I think there's a lot there. And so the takeaway message for this talk, and I'm sorry if I've gone over a little bit, science and math teacher education is a multi-year enterprise. It requires discipline-specific methods instruction, rich clinical experiences, and access to mentoring and feedback. We cannot afford to keep thinking of STEM education as just curricular. If we just have the right kit, we'll solve the STEM education problem. That's the wrong question. That's as wrong as the question of 4 or 5-year colleges, right? It's not just, curriculum's important, don't get me wrong, it's important, but it's not the thing that we ought to be concerned about. It's one of those components. It's one of those 9 puzzle pieces, but it's the sexiest piece, so it gets a lot of attention, and it generates sales, so it has a lot of cheerleaders. When we short-circuit the STEM teacher learning process by having alternate route programs that don't give mentoring, the cost is in teacher attrition. School-based factors are important too. That's actually the #1 reason. So we could solve we could solve the retention problem by improving school conditions. But if we want to, make it more likely that people will stay, we have to give them support. And I'll end with saying that recruitment and retention are wide open areas for innovation and experimentation. We've been experimenting with science teacher education. We've got some good stuff there. Now we need to go out to the margins. And I will end there. Thank you.